Hi everybody, hello, and I hope all of you had a very enjoyable and inspiring Chag. With your permission, I want to go backwards a little bit. I want to share some thoughts about the end of Sukkot that I think carry over into the rest of the year. You know, it's very interesting that Sukkot is a 7-day holiday. It is not an 8-day holiday. And right after the conclusion of Sukkot, there is another holiday called Shemini Atzeret. And Shemini Atzeret is absolutely not Sukkot. In Eretz Yisrael, you understand that very, very clearly because, you know, you do not sit in the sukkah. In the diaspora, it gets a little complicated because of the calendrical doubts. So Shemini Atzeret does have some aspects of Sukkot, but that's only because of the calendrical doubt. But the very last day of Sukkot is Chol HaMoed. It's not a holiday, but it's given a special name, although it's only Chol HaMoed, and that is Hoshana Rabbah. And in the Torah, this day of Hoshana Rabbah has no particular importance other than being the last day of Chol HaMoed Sukkot. And yet we know that from a very early time, it was identified as, number one, a final day of judgment. I'm sure you learned or you heard that on Rosh Hashanah, Hashem inscribes us, gives us a preliminary judgment. On Yom Kippur, it is sealed and signed, but it remains, as it were, in God's drawer, and only on Hoshana Rabbah is it delivered. And therefore, there is this concept that even until Hoshana Rabbah, you could ask Hashem to rip up the check, so to speak. Don't mail it, don't put it in the mail, and the like. But we know that there are two ceremonies about Hoshana Rabbah that are important and significant. And again, you'll see why it's relevant for after Sukkot. First, we go around the bima 7 times, just as in the temple. We encircled the Mizbeach 7 times. And the second ceremony is we take the willow, we take the arava, we shake it, and we bang it. And these are very enigmatic. Both of them are very enigmatic. First of all, this thing about hakafot. Sukkot, you know, if you're a person who gets vertigo or whatever it is, I'm not sure if vertigo is the right word for people who get dizzy if they go in a circle. You know, Sukkot seems to be full of going around in circles. I mean, every single day we go around once. Hoshana Rabbah, we go around 7 times. And then the night of Shemini Atzeret, we go around. And then the morning of Shemini Atzeret, we go around. So there's a lot of encircling that is going on here. Let me just say historically, just so you understand the halachic development of it. Historically, in the time of the Gemara, there were no hakafot at all in Shemini Atzeret. That's a much later thing. So Shemini Atzeret, no hakafot. In the Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim would walk around the Mizbeach once every day, and Hoshana Rabbah, they would walk around 7 times. That's in the Beis HaMikdash. So consequently, we, Bisman Hazeh, as a Zecher LaMikdash, do the same thing. But again, the Hakafot of Simchat Torah or Shemini Atzeret are absolutely post-Talmudic. Not only that, let me just point out a very interesting historical observation. When you ask the average, even Orthodox Jew, why is there a holiday, Shemini Atzeret, Simchat Torah? They'll say, oh, we are celebrating the finishing of the Torah. That is absolutely not the reason for the holiday, and that can be proven very, very conclusively. The Torah was not always finished on an annual cycle. The original minhag of Eretz Yisrael was to finish the Torah on a 3-year cycle. They did not finish the Torah every year. And although the 3-year cycle is a little difficult to reconstruct, and there are different opinions how you did it, but interestingly enough, most of the reconstructions do not even look at Simchat Torah as the starting point, meaning even every 3 years it wasn't Simchat Torah. In fact, the starting point was either Pesach or Shavuos, which actually has a lot of logic. So in a typical Simchat Torah, maybe the Kriyat Torah, the Parsha of the week, might have been Vayikra or something like that. So obviously, it's important to understand that when the Torah made Shemini Atzeret a Chag, it was not because we were finishing the reading of the Torah. First of all, the whole obligation of reading of the Torah is rabbinic. So obviously, that wouldn't be why the Torah made it a holiday. And second of all, even when we started reading the Torah, we weren't finishing it on Simchat Torah. So one has to understand very, very clearly that Simchat Torah, or Shemini Atzeret, as the Torah calls it, was a Yom Tov irrespective of whether you finished the Torah or didn't finish the Torah. And in fact, the Gemara itself explains the nature of Shemini Atzeret in a very powerful way, that during Sukkot we brought korbanot, 70 bulls, 70 bulls, and that corresponds to the 70 nations of the world that tried to destroy us. And on Sukkot, it's a very unusual configuration because it goes down in number. Day 1, 13, day 2, 12, 11, 6, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. And that represents the idea that as we get closer and closer to Yemot HaMashiach, the power of the 70 nations is going to diminish, become weaker. And even if we look around and we seem to see a resurgence of terrorism and a resurgence of anti-Semitism, and of course, less than 70 years ago we had a Holocaust, but nevertheless that's understood mystically as kind of the death throes, just as a candle has one final burst of energy before it dies, so evil will have a certain appearance of power. So Sukkot is about the 70 nations of the world, but there are two takes on that. One is the one I just said, that their power gets diminished. The other take is more of a positive take, that we pray on their behalf and we ask Hashem to bless them. So Sukkot has a universalistic aspect in which we're not just Jews, but we're citizens of the world who care about society. And of course, that is one of the characteristics of the Jewish people. The Jewish people have contributed greatly to every society of which they have been a part of. And to this very day, Israel itself extends itself quite generously to many, many countries who are not our greatest friends. And still, the Jews, the Israeli government and the Israeli people, the Jewish people, step forward. In fact, it's something to be very, very proud of. In fact, there was a non-Jewish, very, very prominent journalist in Spain who wrote a very powerful article someone sent me a few years ago, in which he said that in the 1930s and 40s, Europe made a choice to get rid of the Jews because the Jews were parasitic and the Jews were undermining society. So God made a deal with them. God said, okay, you don't want the Jews? We'll give you the Muslims instead. Then ask yourself the difference in what Jews contributed to society. Again, I don't mean to be racist and label every single Muslim. Again, that's not my purpose. But just as a general phenomenon, it's just a reality you cannot deny. Every society in which Jews become a part, become productive, grows, succeeds. And every society in which you have massive infusions of Muslims goes down the tubes. I mean, this is what is happening to Europe. Europe is essentially getting destroyed by its immigration policies, and the United States too is suffering very, very greatly. So this non-Jewish reporter just said, God gave you a choice. You didn't want the Jews, you'll get somebody else.
The United States not quite yet.
Huh?
Not the United States.
Not quite yet. Not quite yet. Yeah. That's correct. That's correct. But Germany and England and France, you see what is happening to those countries. So it turns out, though, Sukkot has a universalistic aspect. But Shemini Atzeret is described in this way. A melech makes a party for all of his subjects, and everybody comes, and it's fancy, fancy, fancy. And at the end of the party, everybody goes home. And the melech says to his closest and dearest friend, let's go into the kitchen and have a simple cup of coffee together. Shemini Atzeret is the day of intimacy with God, unique to the Jewish people. But the point I want to make historically is, this is even before it was the Siyum HaTorah. I'll get to Hoshana Rabbah, but I want to share with you a very interesting ha'ora of the Or Sameach, the Meshech Chochmah. And that is, the Gemara in Maseches Megillah, when it goes through what is the Torah reading for each day, so it says The Torah reading for Shemini Atzeret is Zot HaBracha, the last parsha of the Torah. And the Haftorah, the prophetic reading for Shemini Atzeret, is Vayamod Shlomo. Now let me explain this. You know, the first temple, the temple that Shlomo HaMelech built, was dedicated in the month of Tishrei. And it was a 14-day dedication ceremony, ending on Shemini Atzeret.
Including Yom Kippur.
Yes, interestingly enough, Yom Kippur is right in the middle, and the Gemara tells us that Yom Kippur they ate and they drank because they were celebrating the dedication of the temple. The conclusion of the temple's dedication was on Shemini Atzeret, and on Shemini Atzeret, Shlomo HaMelech blessed the Jewish people before he sent them home, and this is called Birkat HaMelech, and the Gemara in Megillah says that this is the appropriate Haftorah. Now, in a way, that's very logical, because the Torah reading is Moshe Rabbeinu's blessing to the Jewish people. The Haftorah would be Shlomo HaMelech's blessing to the Jewish people. And yet, there's a very big problem with that. And that is not the Haftorah that we read yesterday. The Haftorah we read yesterday is from the first chapter of Yehoshua, which talks about Moshe Rabbeinu dying and Yoshua being given the mission of leadership, and Hashem telling Yoshua, Chazak v'yamatz, be strong, you need to go forward. So Tosfos asks the question, how could our minhag depart from the explicit law of the Gemara? The Babylonian Talmud is a binding halachic source, and if the Babylonian Talmud tells us that the appropriate Haftorah for Shemini Atzeret is the Haftorah about Shlomo HaMelech blessing the people, then that should be the appropriate Haftorah. So Tosfos doesn't really answer it, but he says, Shamati, I heard that in the time of Rav Hai Gaon, one of the great Gaonim, they changed it. But that doesn't answer the question. How could Rav Hai Gaon change it, and why would he change it? So listen to what the Meshech Chochmah says. The Meshech Chochmah says a fascinating point. He says that when the Gemara in Megillah says the Kriyat HaTorah of Shemini Atzeret is Zot HaBracha, it was not because you were finishing the Torah. Meaning, even when you were operating on a 3-year cycle, and you were, let's say, up to Parshat Vayikra, but the Yom Tov reading of Shemini Atzeret was Zot HaBracha, meaning not because you were finishing the Torah, but rather, since Shemini Atzeret is a day of intimacy and love, we read about the brachot that Moshe Rabbeinu said. Now, under that original configuration, they didn't read to the end of the parsha. They only read the blessings, because they weren't finishing the Torah. This was just like, for example, the first day of Sukkot. The Kriyas HaTorah is from Parshas Emor. So the last day, Shemini Atzeret, the Kriyas is Zos HaBracha. And by the way, you can prove this, because in a way, on Yom Tov you have to have 5 mandatory aliyot. If you look at the Kriyat of Simchat Torah, the 5 mandatory aliyot do not include Chatan Torah and Chatan Bereshit. The 5 mandatory aliyot take you until the conclusion of the blessing of the tribes. And that's a very interesting historical indicator that the original Kriyat HaTorah only included the blessings, and that dates back to where the Torah was read on a 3-year cycle. So we didn't have to read about Moshe's death. We weren't finishing the Torah. We're simply reading about the love that Hashem has for Bnei Yisrael as seen from the brachos that Moshe Rabbeinu gave. And again, if you look at those brachos, they're very, very moving, actually. Moshe Rabbeinu is looking at a nation that gave him a lot of trouble over the past 40 years. Their parents, now it's a new generation, the parents gave him trouble, and the children gave him trouble. And there were a lot of times that Moshe Rabbeinu himself, didn't want the job. And there were times that Hashem wanted to destroy Am Yisrael. And Moshe prayed, but now he's leaving them. And as he's leaving them, his true feelings come out. The love and the care and the goodness that he sees in them. One has to really see this as a parent taking leave of a troublesome child, but a child that he loves so deeply, and in this world is not going to see again. So, Reb Meir Simcha says, based on this historical observation, here is the point. When the Gemara says that the Haftorah of Shemini Atzeret was Shlomo Melech's bracha, that is dating from the time when they still read the Torah in a 3-year cycle, and the only thing they read in Zot HaBracha were the brachot. So the most logical Haftarah would be the brachot of Shlomo. But when they switched over to the 1-year cycle, and therefore Shemini Atzeret became the day that we finish the Torah, and we include the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is going further, at that point, it was decided that the most logical thing to focus on is the transition from the death of Moshe to Yoshua. And therefore, Reb Meir Simcha says, our minhag is not a contradiction to the Gemara's ruling, because the Gemara's ruling was referring to an earlier historical time when the Kriyat Torah did not include Moshe Rabbeinu's death, it was only the brachot. Which means, in other words, if we ask a simple question, why do we read Zot HaBracha and Shemini Atzeret? We actually have 2 different answers. Answer 1 is that since Shemini Atzeret represents a day of intimacy and love, we read about the blessings that Moshe Rabbeinu gave. Answer 2 is, since later it became the day that we finish the Torah, so we read it because that's the last parsha that we have to read. But that's a later development. The notion of transition, though, which has now become dominant, because that's the Torah that we have, is a very, very interesting thing. You know, one of the, I don't know if it's a jarring experience, but it might be for some. You know, I remember, in the history of English machzorim, right? So the most popular English machzor today is, of course, the Art Scroll machzor. That's their bestseller. If you remember, before Art Scroll, the Birnbaum machzor was a major one that many synagogues have. But if you're really old, you may remember the Adler machzor. Now, the Adler machzor is quite interesting because the translators were British, and they had a certain literary flair, and they tried to translate the piyutim in the same poetic meter as the Hebrew. So they would actually translate it in various rhymes, but the syntax was horrendous because they would like move a verb at the very end of, they just moved around verbs and adjectives and everything else to get that rhyme. But it really was quite an amazing skill. But I remember that in the Adler Machzor, I remember this as a kid, it just struck me. Shemini Atzeret was translated as the 8th day of solemn assembly. Now, assembly I understand, because one of the translations of Atzeret can be assembly. But where do you get solemn assembly? Simchat Torah, a solemn assembly. So my guess is they put in the solemn because of Yizkor. Because, there are many Jews. Of course, you have the proverbial three-day a year Jew, right? The 2 days Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, but also there is the Yizkor Jew. Even Jews who were not very religious, just as they would take Shabbos, they take Yizkor very, very seriously. And synagogues try to make Yizkor a significant, serious, reflective occasion, as it should be. So one of the jarring aspects, perhaps, in Eretz Israel. So in Chutz La'aretz, right, we have Yizkor on day 8, and we have the Simchas Torah the next day, that night. So that's, you kind of separate. In Eretz Israel, we put everything together, right? So we have Hakavos, and then we have Yizkor, right? Kind of a little bit of a strange thing. Which just kind of reminds you, as Kohelet said, there's a time for everything. A time to laugh, a time to cry, and you have to understand that life has all of these different aspects, and you have to incorporate all of them, and sometimes virtually the same time. So that's what life in Israel is in many, many ways. So in a sense, the juxtaposition on Shemini Atzeret is a mirror of what life is, the bitter and the sweet all coming together, and understanding that even the bitter is, on some level, a gift from Hashem, teaching us how to deal with life. But the thing about Yizkor I want to share with you is an interesting thought, and that is, Yizkor is about memory, remembering the past. remembering the people that we love, remembering bichlal, the losses that we and the Jewish people have suffered. But you know, a person, the way a person relates to the past, there has to be a combination of memory and forgetting. I don't mean totally forgetting, but in a sense, you can't be overly connected to a past. Because if you get overly connected to a past, you get paralyzed. And you're not able to deal with the life that you have now. This was actually an issue. You know, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, you will actually find in America, there were rabbanim in all sorts of crazy places, Omaha, Nebraska, small towns in Massachusetts, who literally were gedolei Torah mamish, people who were as great as the greatest rabbis in Europe. And by and large, number one, their own children, by and large, totally not religious. And many of them are just lost now through intermarriage, they're their descendants. And they didn't create any infrastructure, no yeshivos, nothing. And part of it was that to them, Judaism was defined by what existed in Vilna, and in Brisk, and in Minsk, and in Warsaw. And they came to an environment where that just wasn't there. And you know, Voltaire used to say, famous statement, the best is the enemy of the better. When you envision only a certain standard of perfection as the only standard, then when you're given suboptimal conditions, you do nothing with it. And in some ways, that was the situation. They said, what can America ever become? America's not going to be Vilna, it's not going to be Brisk, it's not going to be Volozhin, it's not going to be Tels. Why bother to waste your time on it? So you see, in order to successfully deal with a new environment and a new set of challenges, on one hand, you have to look at the past as a source of inspiration and a source of guidance and a source of role models. But you also have to say, I'm going to disengage from that past a little bit because I have a new life and a new circumstance, which is not going to be Vilna or Brisk or Volozhin, but it can still be something good. And I'll make it as good as I can make it. Aliyah is an example of that on a personal level, right? Every person who makes Aliyah has left, and for most part, has left some things behind that are very, very precious. And sometimes they're hard to replace, and sometimes they're not going to be replaced. Different friendships, different relationships, although Baruch Hashem, you don't have to sever a relationship, even in Chutz La'aretz. Finding your place. Again, people often do have difficulty finding their place in this country. And yet, a person understands, if a person is led to understand that this is Hashem's land and this is where Hashem wants the Jewish people to live, you can't, as it were, be fixated on the idea that unless I can replicate everything that I had in the old environment, it's not going to be good, because then, frankly, it'll never be good. So this is the paradox of Yizkor. You remember, but you also have to forget. You can't be a prisoner of memory. And there's a wonderful remez to this. In Yosef, Yosef had two sons. Now, look at Yosef's own history. He was ripped in a most brutal way, sold into slavery by his own brothers who actually wanted to even kill him initially. And he's taken from Eretz Yisrael, he's taken from the home of Yaakov Avinu, the Avos, and he's thrown into a decadent, immoral, corrupt environment of sinfulness, licentiousness, Mitzrayim. And he languishes as a slave, and he's imprisoned, and eventually he makes his way up. The very first child that he has, he calls Menashe. Menashe means Noshani Elokim. God has enabled me to forget. Now you would think, that's not a positive statement. Baruch Hashem, God has enabled me to forget my father's home. What type of statement is that? The answer is, it's exactly this thing. Meaning, if my mental image is, you can have a meaningful life only in that kedusha and in that environment, and there's nothing you can do here, then he's throwing in the towel, and he's basically saying, my life is over. So he says, God gave me the capacity to forget so I could move on. But now remember, this is not total forgetfulness. In fact, Chazal tell us that whenever Yaakov was tempted, whenever Yosef was tempted, he had an image of his father. So of course he didn't forget. But it means he was not a prisoner of that memory. Memory can imprison a person in negative ways. I'll give you a trivial example. Maybe it's not so trivial. Let's say a person's greatest accomplishment in his life was he was a marathoner in his 20s, right? He ran races and he was a great, great athlete. And as he looks back at his life, those were his fondest moments and his greatest memories. And now he's 85 years old. Well, there probably are 85-year-olds who run marathons, I guess, but not that many. In other words, and basically he certainly cannot do it at the speed that he did it then. But you see, if the meaning of his life is defined by the accomplishments that were only possible at an earlier age, then essentially what he's saying is, my life is just downhill. So you need a certain forgetfulness in the sense of emotionally detaching yourself and understanding that different stages in life have different meanings and different jobs and different tasks. And one's avoda in life is to try to find the unique task for which they are suited and equipped at every stage of their life. In fact, lo aleinu, we should all be blessed to have good health, but sometimes it can be that sickness and disability may be a person's task to show that they accept Hashem's difficult judgments with equanimity and with serenity, and in that way become an inspiration for others who are suffering. That is a task, right? That is an avoda too. So that is why Yizkor is the paradox of memory and forgetting. And that is the significance of transition, going back to the Haftorah. Because there never was, in terms of Jewish leadership, there never was a greater loss than Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest of the prophets, the one who was closest to God more than any other human being who ever lived and ever will live. Who could possibly replace Moshe Rabbeinu? Nobody. And one could try to imagine how psychologically devastating it was to Am Yisrael that right before this new experience of coming to a land with all sorts of enemies and unknown challenges, the one who shepherded them through everything is leaving. And yet, what does the Haftorah teach us? Chazak v'yamatz. No matter what you lose, you got to look at the world that you have and make it good. And you can't be a prisoner to even the most glorious past that you had. Rav Soloveitchik used to say there was a certain year in the 1960s, a very tragic year for him. In fact, many say he was never the same from that point on, in which he had lost his brother and his mother and then his wife. He lost three very, very beloved people in 1 year. And he said that, we're reading in Parshas Bereishis about God creating the world, and there's a whole big problem because the Torah says the Spirit of God was hovering over the water. Where did the water come from? If Hashem is creating the world now, the universe now, why is there water? So the Medrash actually says there were prior worlds to this one that Hashem destroyed. In fact, that is the simplest answer to things like dinosaurs and fossils. That, the Torah is starting the creation cycle from man, but there could have been prior worlds that got destroyed in various cataclysms. So Rav Soloveitchik used to say, why did God do? God could have gotten things right. Why did he create worlds that he then destroyed? So he said, Because Hashem wants to teach us a lesson that if you have a world that gets destroyed, you have to go on and recreate, because God himself had worlds that were destroyed, although he destroyed it, but he destroyed it to teach us that idea, that even if your world is destroyed, you go on and you rebuild. This, of course, has been the characteristic of Am Yisrael in all the generations. Think about all the Holocaust survivors who lost their families and still had the courage to start again and build again. Do they forget their losses? No, they don't. Of course they remember their losses. Of course they're connected to their losses. Of course there's going to be something in their heart that will never heal. We're not, God forbid, talking about callous indifference. But you got to relegate it to a corner. You can't let it take over. There's part of you that has that. But you go on and you rebuild. Because Hashem created worlds, even though all of those old worlds got destroyed. And this is what Am Yisrael does. We follow the way of God, in which we don't give in to despair. And of course, more recently in Eretz Yisrael, and we have so many cases, again, lo aleinu, and we hope and we pray that these should not happen again, of terrorist attacks and of Jewish people, sometimes just children, being ruthlessly murdered. And yet we also see at the same time, side by side, the magnificent emunah of the families, the parents, the spouses, who go on and they say, we're not going to give in to despair. We will rebuild. We will recreate. We know that life is sometimes hard and sometimes tragic, but we don't give up. We keep on going. And Rav Soloveitchik said that was the midah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of Borei Olamot Umachrivan. So that's what kind of Yizkor is about, and that's what transition is about. No matter how devastating the loss, you gotta go on. You gotta rebuild. And that means there has to be a certain disengagement and detachment from the past. So the past should not be overpowering and controlling. And as I indicated, this actually was one of the reasons why until the aftermath of World War II, Jewish religious life in America was not very successful, in spite of the fact that there were many, many great rabbis. But some of the great rabbis frankly said, can't do anything in America, it's not Vilna, it's not Volozhin. Therefore, there was no use to even try to do anything, because it's not going to work. Okay. And again, I think Voltaire said it well. The best becomes the enemy of the better. If you think, in fact, the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Or Sameach, Rav Mendel Weinbach, Zichrono Livracha, said it in a very cute way. I'm sure all of us have heard from our mothers, or we've used it ourselves, the saying, anything worth doing is worth doing well. So Rav Weinbach changed it a little bit. He said, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Mm-hmm. And that actually is a wise statement, because if something is worth doing, even if you're not going to do a perfect job, your attitude shouldn't be, I'm not going to bother. You do as much as you can do. Because if it's a worthwhile endeavor, it'll be worthwhile only if it's 50% or 20%, because 25% is better than 0%. And therefore, if it's worth doing, do it even if you're not going to do such a great job. And that's an important lesson in life generally, because many adults talk about things they wish they would have done. So just to give you an example, again, it's not a religious example per se, but there have been different surveys like, do you have any regrets that you should have pursued certain things? So many people say, I wish I would have pursued playing a musical instrument. When I was a kid, I had a year of piano, etc., but I wish I would have stayed with it. It would have given me something that would have given me a lot of pleasure, right? But now you're 50 or 60, so why don't you start playing the piano again, right? So the answer is going to be, well, at 50, I'm certainly not going to be, I'm not going to develop very well. Okay, so you're not going to play well, but you can do something, right? The concept that if I can't be perfect, I want to do it. is something that stops a person from a lot of constructive activity that could give a person a lot of pleasure, and that's kal v'chomer true for Torah and mitzvahs. Okay, so I think, as I say, we live in a land, and we live in a world, it's not only limited to Eretz Israel, where all sorts of unpredictable things do happen. And even if it's true, as we hope and we pray, that the power of the 70 nations is getting diminished, as it were, but nevertheless, this last death throw, so to speak, could be very, very powerful and disconcerting. And we have to know that although there are losses, we have to have chazak v'yamatz, the courage to go on. By the way, there's a very fascinating comment from the Vilna Gaon about the 70 nations. Of course, the UN has more than 70 nations, but they all come from the 70 nations. The Vilna Gaon says 35 of the nations come from Esav, and 35 of the nations come from Yishmael. Now, one has to understand what the Vilna Gaon means. He absolutely does not mean that 35 nations are descended from Esav and 35 nations are descended from Yishmael. In point of fact, none of the 70 nations are descended from Yishmael or Esav. If you look in Parshat Noach, they are from the Shem, Cham, and Yafes, but they're not from the Avraham line. They're from all the other children and the like. So if the Vilna Gaon says 35 nations are Yishmael and 35 nations are Esav, he is not referring to genealogy. In terms of genealogy, none of them are from Esav or Yishmael. But he means in terms of spiritual power, their potency. 35 nations are getting their spiritual energy from Esav, and 35 nations are getting their spiritual energy from Yishmael. What is the nature of that negative spiritual energy? What exactly is the difference? We talk about, in other words, the prototypical villains that try to destroy us are the Yishmael villains and the Esav villains. What's the difference between them? So here is one suggestion. Esav represents what you might call the world of hedonistic materialism. A world in which God does not have a role and God does not have a place, and the only thing that matters is power, pleasure, control of others, and egotism. We see this with Esav, because Esav comes from the field and Esav is famished, and Yaakov wants to buy the birthright of Esav. The birthright is the right to be the spiritual leader. And Esav remarks, Hine anochi holech lamut. Behold, I am going to die. Lama ze li b'chocha. Why do I need the birthright? So Chazal offer an interesting interpretation. It doesn't simply mean, as you might say, oh, I'm so hungry, if I don't have the beans, I'm going to die. Rather, Esav is making a theological statement. All that counts in this world is eat, drink, and be merry, my physical life. After I die, there is no olam haba, there is no neshama. So what do I need this for? And that's why it says, Vayives Esav es ha-bechorah. He despised the bechorah. It was worthless. It was nothing at all. So Esav represents that power in the world that focuses on hedonism, pleasure, wealth, egotism. And that's one type of enemy the Jewish people face, which is really a spiritual threat, in which we are threatened not by an enemy who wants to kill us necessarily, but we're threatened by all of the allures of Western civilization. Now, Western civilization has, of course, many, many positive aspects. One is not going to deny that. Chazal talk about Chachma Bagoyim Tamin, that there is wisdom among the non-Jews. But at the same time, that wisdom is often put towards the ends of satisfying the material and animalistic parts of man. Think about the entertainment industry, in which you have brilliant people who are really smart and talented, and they put in, while yeshivot and all sorts of worthy causes are suffering and cannot pay even a decent living wage. You have billions and billions and billions of dollars, many of them funded by Jews, going to these types of pursuits. So Esav represents the nisayon of trying to relegate God either into non-existence or into irrelevancy. Yishmael represents a very opposite type of problem. Now I understand, you can't identify Yishmael and Islam 100%. First of all, Yishmael obviously lived way before Islam. And I do understand, I'll make this point, not every Muslim is an Arab, and not every Arab is a Muslim. That's 100% true. Iran, for example, are non-Arabic Muslims. And of course, in the Arab world, there are Christians as well. I understand that the correlation is not complete, but by and large, the overlap is extremely substantial. And it is said that Islamic fundamentalism is rooted in a certain ideology of Yishmael, going back to Yishmael. And that is the idea that God is very much part of their consciousness. But it's a God that is co-opted, kind of kidnapped, hijacked for immorality, for hatred, for destruction. So, when the Vilna Gaon says 35 nations are Yishmael and 35 nations are Esav, he means metaphorically that the Jewish people are going to face two different threats as we approach the Geulah. One is the threat of Western hedonistic materialism, and the other is the threat of hateful religious fanaticism. And that's what the Vilna Gaon means. Some of it is Esav, and some of it is Yishmael. What is interesting is that these represent not only forces outside of us, but these represent tensions within our own personalities. When a person, as it were, succumbs to laziness, indifference, lack of interest or passion in Avodat Hashem, that's the Esav that's pulling him away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When a person succumbs to religious fanaticism, intolerance, bigotry, and sinat chinam in the guise of being l'shem shamayim, that's the Yishmael in him that's talking. Now, I hasten to add, I am not drawing a moral equivalence between an Arab terrorist and any Jew. Baruch Hashem, even when we have our religious fanaticism, as deplorable as it is not the same as their religious fanaticism. One needs to understand that we don't have Jews that, God forbid, murder children. But on a spiritual level, there is a commonality. And that is, you use the name of God to besmirch, to delegitimate, to demonize, to consider someone as not worthy, even though the word Amalek gets thrown around. And when you have a religious chayil who may go to a Beit Knesset and somebody spits on him, where does that come from? It doesn't come from God, it doesn't come from Torah, it doesn't come from Judaism. It comes from the midah of Yishmael that takes the name of God and uses it for hatred and polarization and destruction. So it's not just the Esav and Yishmael that's out there, so to speak. There's the Esav and Yishmael that's within us. And by the way, Amalek, which represents the epitome of evil, is said by the Arizal to be based on the conjunction of Esav and Yishmael. It's a little complicated because in the Torah, although it's true that one of Esav's wives was a daughter of Yishmael, unfortunately, Amalek did not come from that union. So you can't make a direct case that Amalek is the union of Esav and Yishmael. But the Arizal spiritually says, he proves it in various gematrios and various other numerology and letter symbolism, that Amalek is the combination of Esav and Yishmael, and that creates the evil that exists in the world. By the way, the Maharal makes a point, which is amazing. The Maharal wrote this in the 1500s, that B'acharit hayamim, Persia will resurrect and join with Yishmael to persecute the Jewish people. So that answers the argument, well, how can you talk about Yishmael as being in fault? The Iranians are not Arabs. Okay, the Iranians are Persians. And the Maharal says that Haman will kind of, because Haman is Amalek, right? That Amalek finds his natural place in Persia as well, and therefore Paras is going to get together. Right, so the 70 nation thing is a very, very interesting point. And Sukkot as a whole has a very, very strong Messianic component. I don't know if you know this. Both the Haftarah for day one of Sukkot and the Haftarah for Shabbat Chol HaMoed Sukkot deal with the war of Gog and Magog, which is described in the book of Zechariah, that's the first day of Sukkot, and described in the book of Yecheskel, which is Shabbat Chol HaMoed. And by the way, I mean, let me make an obvious point. I mean, it is very obvious, but people sometimes get it wrong. Gog and Magog are not the two sides. It's not the war of Gog against Magog. That is absolutely not correct. If you read the pasuk, you see a man called Gog is the melech of a nation called Magog, and the people they're fighting are the Jewish people. Right? So it's Gog and Magog is one side. Now, who is Gog and Magog? We don't know. And the only thing we do know is they are described as coming Me'eretz Safona, from the north. And different Meforshim going all the way back to Rav Sadia Gaon. Some identify it with Turkey, and some identify it with Russia, and some identify it with Germany, and various confederations, and the like. And has the war already happened, and what would it be, etc. Me'eretz Safon, and of course in the book of Daniel, we are told of great wars between the king of the north and the king of the south. And it's not, at all clear what that's talking about. The one thing the Rambam tells us is, Christians love to try to take contemporary events and read them into biblical prophecies. And at least in Israel, many Jews like to do that as well. Although normally it was a Christian thing. The Rambam tells us that that's a very futile exercise, because only when Mashiach comes will you then be able to go backwards and understand how every biblical prophecy was fulfilled. But as things are happening, you really don't know. Although, intriguingly, there was an oral tradition from the Vilna Gaon. This is phenomenal. And no one knew what it meant. Now it's in writing, but it was preserved orally for more than 100 years. That the war of Gog and Magog will last for 12 minutes. And no one understood what type of war could be over in 12 minutes. Now, we do understand what type of war could be over in 12 minutes. And now, if you go back to the Navi Zechariah, you see things that, because it talks about the enemy, the flesh on the faces of the enemy will melt. What could that be describing, right? That could actually be describing, God forbid, a nuclear holocaust, or at least some type of nuclear destruction. The good news is that the wars of Gog and Magog can be circumvented, meaning they're not inevitable, meaning Chazal say through Tshuva and Masim Tovim and various good deeds you could be saved and spared from the wars of Gog and Magog.
Who teaches that?
Huh?
Did you say?
Which
Who
one?
teaches that those events can be?
That's the Gemara. The Gemara in Masechah Shabbos tells us.
Any negative prophecy doesn't. Any negative prophecy.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
What do you, have you read like the Bible codes by Monticello Glazerson?
Yeah.
What do you hold from those kind of?
Well, they're interesting. I mean, unless they're rooted in very authoritative sources, I just take them as speculation. I can't assign any automatic credence to them. I'll tell you part of the problem. Part of the problem, this is a fundamental issue, is that the Bible codes can only describe things that already happened. So you look for Hitler in Amalek. The Bible codes cannot make any predictions because you don't know what you're looking for. So if somebody could somehow use the Bible code to predict an event that has not yet happened, and then the event happens,
That's
that would be
prophecy.
a very, very...
It's nevuah.
Well, that would be
We
the...
don't have
Well, they could use a
nevuah.
code. If they could somehow crack a code and use it as a predictive mechanism. In fact, that's how Einstein's theory of relativity got proven. I mean, he predicted some astronomical event based on his theory, and it happened. So the problem is that the Bible codes have only worked to show how the past is encoded, and therefore the concept is you're looking for something that introduced. Now, again, I'm not enough of a scientist to be able to give a whole technical evaluation, but some have claimed that when you're looking for specific results, there's a certain bias built in, and therefore you would need a predictive thing for the future. So the Bible codes are interesting. I'm not denying it at all, and I do believe that in principle they could be true, but I just wouldn't make my faith rest on it one way or the other. And you know, there are experts that debate this. This is a very sharp debate. There are some probability experts who are absolutely convinced that the Bible codes represent a divine encoding. Harold Gans, who I know from Maryland, Doron Whitsom, you know, these are big experts who really swear, so to speak, by the Bible codes. There are others who are much more skeptical, and I can't automatically dismiss their skepticism.
Could you just say what you're going to say at the beginning, how going back helps us now for the future?
Say again?
Could you just go back what you said at the beginning of the class,
Yeah.
how looking back at the previous holidays are going to help us
Yeah.
now?
No, so the basic lesson that I'm leaving you with is that, number one, that Sukkot is a great message of hope, because it reminds us of the 70 Parim, that although the 70 nations persecute us, but their power does diminish. Transition reminds us, the death of Moshe reminds us that even when we have great losses, we have to go on and we have to build and we have to have chizuk and the like. The Esav and Yishmael reminds us that the two forces that we face is one spiritual apathy and the other is religious fanaticism, and both of them are dangerous and negative and destructive. And of course, let me just say generally, you know, we've been through a single month, not even a whole month, 3 weeks, basically. You know, I'll end with this story because it's a cute story. There was a fellow in Russia, it's a made-up story. There was a fellow in Russia who became Jewish because he was in a Hasidic community, and he really loved all the parties. There were constant celebrations. He converted, let's say, around Rosh Chodesh Shvat, so it was great. Rosh Chodesh Shvat, they have a big party. Rosh Chodesh Tu B'Shvat, a great party. Rosh Chodesh Adar, a great party. Purim, a super party. Rosh Chodesh Nisan, party. Pesach, great party. So he tells his friend, you know, listen, you got to join this religion. This is the greatest religion. Yeah, parties and drinking and eating and festivals, and it's just tremendous. So his friend didn't get around to it till around Tammuz, the beginning of Tammuz. So Tammuz, he immediately gets hit with Shiva Zarba Tammuz and the 3 weeks and the 9 days, and no music and no weddings and no wine and no meat. All these deprivations, fast days. So he goes over to his friend and says, hey, you know, you told me this is a religion of parties and celebration, and all I get are fast days of deprivation. So the first guy scratches his head and says, you know, I don't know, ever since you joined, we've been going downhill. I don't know what happened here. But the truth is, that is the nature of sacred time. We go through all of these different experiences. We have times of joy and times of sadness, and times of jubilation and times of introspection. But what's interesting is, in the first 3 weeks of a single month, we go through all of those emotions. We have times of seriousness, somberness, reflection, fear, trepidation, times of joy, times of remembering the deaths and the loss of our loved ones on the very same day that we dance with the Torah. Because what is the following? Life will give you all of these different experiences. So in the beginning of the year, it's like a template or a model how to deal with everything that life will give you. You kind of have to experience it in an accelerated way to be able to take. All of us have a natural personality. So for example, some people love singing and dancing and lebedik. They're very happy, joyous personalities. There are other people, I'll tell you, that there are people who actually, if I can use the word, they enjoy Tisha B'Av more than Simchas Torah. What do I mean, enjoy Tisha B'Av? I don't mean enjoy in the sense that, I'm singing and dancing, but they enjoy the idea of reflection, the idea of thinking, the idea of cheshbon hanefesh. They're not so comfortable, necessarily singing and dancing. So there are what you might call Tisha B'Av people, and there are what you might call Simchas Torah people. And, maybe it correlates introvert, extrovert. There are different ways of correlating. Even with rabbis, they actually say there are cat rabbis and dog rabbis. They say. The dog rabbi is the rabbi, hi, how you doing? Slaps you on the shoulder. The cat rabbi would rather, learn or whatever it is. In fact, they say the cat rabbi prefers officiating at a funeral than to going to a chasna. Whatever it is. There are different personalities this way. But what Hashem is teaching you is, you got to learn to serve Hashem with all aspects of the human personality. The Tisha B'Av person has to learn how to sing and dance. And the Simchas Torah person has to learn how to be reflective and serious. Because you can't just serve God with whatever your comfort level is. You got to stretch. You got to go beyond your comfort level. So the overall message of the month of Tishrei, right, the overall message of this great season that is now over, is serve Hashem as a complete and total person. Right? You have a spectrum of emotions and feelings. Don't just take that narrow part of the spectrum. Appreciate the entire spectrum and serve Hashem accordingly in that way. And that is why some say Cheshvan is the most important month of the year. Because Cheshvan is the most ordinary month. No Chagim in Cheshvan. There's a famous word, although it's grammatically absolutely not true. So I'm going to tell you ahead of time it's not true, but they call Mar Cheshvan. It's called Mar Cheshvan, meaning the bitter Cheshvan, because there are no holidays. Now actually that is not the reason why it's called Mar Cheshvan. Mar is connected to rain, etc. But be it as it may, the folk thought is that Mar Cheshvan is connected to the notion that Cheshvan does not have Chagim. And the lesson is, it is the litmus test. Have the Chagim transformed us? Meaning, the Chazon Ish used to say, it's very easy to be inspired when you're in moments of inspiration. But the true test of whether something has made a roshem on you is how do you behave when you're away from the inspiration. The mashal that he gave was, when a pot overflows when it's on the fire, that does not tell you how full the pot is, because even a half-empty pot will overflow when it's on the fire. But when it's off the fire and it's cold, then if it's half-empty, it's not going to overflow. If it's full, it will. So the fact that I'm inspired during a Chag doesn't mean I've really filled up with holiness. It's only afterwards that you can tell. And that is why Cheshvan is the great litmus test, whether the Chagim have truly changed it. So, B'ezrat Hashem, we now kind of begin the year in earnest, because all of this was preparing us for the challenges of Tov Shinai and Tes, 5779. I'm living in the past, okay? And B'ezrat Hashem, it should be a year of bracha, a year of shalom, a year of growth, a year of avodat Hashem, and again, as I say, peace and health for Eretz Yisrael, for Am Yisrael, and really B'ezrat Hashem for all of the world.
Amen.